She recited the forgotten verse as a jest, unaware the Alpha King's seal had named her his Luna. I was 40 years old the night the seal blazed, and I had stopped believing it ever would. That is the honest beginning. Not the verse, not the woman, not the gold light that split the undercroft from wall to wall, but the 40 years before it, the careful, deliberate work of teaching myself not to want a thing I could not have. The seal of Varenthal had sat cold in its carved cradle in the undercroft since before my grandfather's grandfather drew his first breath. For centuries, the archive text said. 411 years, to be precise. I had counted when I was young and still believed that knowing the exact number would make the waiting feel ordered, purposeful. The way a locked room feels different from an empty one if you can name what is inside it. It did not help. A number is only a number. The seal was still cold. The hall was still dark. Every alpha of Varenthal before me had waited. Every alpha after would wait, or would not, that I had accepted, in the particular way that a man accepts something he cannot change without surrendering the part of himself that keeps him upright. I had accepted it the way I accepted the northern winters, without complaint, without the pretense that complaint would shorten them. My council had not accepted it. My council never fully accepted anything I accepted, which was part of what made them useful. The Brynville daughter comes next month, my steward Orvith told me at the close of the autumn sessions. He was a careful man, spare with words, which meant that when he chose to spend them on this subject I was required to acknowledge them. Her father says she has her mother's gift for the old language. They all have gifts, I said. The Morthweald daughter had a gift. The Callantine girl had 3. The seal did not care. Orvith said nothing. He had learned over 20 years of service when nothing was the correct response. 63 women had pressed their palms to the seal of Varenthal. I did not keep the list myself. The archive kept it, as the archive kept everything in Varenthal, carved in verse blocks on the Undercroft walls, patient and permanent. 63 women from the highest houses in the northern kingdoms, each one presented with appropriate ceremony, each one placing her right hand flat against the carved stone disc and holding it there while the hall held its breath. Silence, every time. The stone neither warmed nor glowed. It simply sat, exactly as it had sat for 411 years, cold as the mountain it had been cut from. I had been present for 41 of those attempts. I had watched 41 women lift their hands from the stone with that particular expression, not quite grief, not quite relief, the expression of a person who has been told something they already suspected but had hoped to be wrong about. I had thanked each of them with the courtesy their families deserved, and I had walked back up the Undercroft stairs alone, and I had returned to the work of governing Varenthal, which was considerable, and which did not pause for personal disappointments. That was the life I had made, and it was not a small life. Varenthal was a kingdom worth governing, stone walls that had never fallen, an archive that scholars traveled weeks to study, wolf packs who had held the northern passes for 6 generations without being broken. I had given everything I had to this kingdom, and it had given me back a purpose and a dignity. And if there was a particular cold that lived in the center of my chest that no fire in the hall had ever quite reached, I had learned to govern around it the way a good road is built around a rock too large to move. My wolf did not agree with this accommodation. My wolf had never agreed with it, but my wolf had also been silent on the matter for so long, 20 years at least, since the last time I had seen a woman who made him stir with anything other than polite indifference, that I had come to think of his silence as concurrence. He had stopped fighting what was. I told myself this was wisdom. He did not dispute it. This is what I remember of the week before she arrived. The first early snow had come to Varenthal, thinner than usual, more ice than depth. The archive Undercroft was cold enough that Orvith had ordered the scribes to work above stairs. I had walked down there myself in the early dark, as I sometimes did when the council chamber felt too much like a room where men were always wanting things from me, and I had stood in front of the seal for a while the way one stands in front of an old debt, not with anger, not with hope, just with a kind of acknowledgement. It is still here. I am still here. Nothing has changed. Good night. I went back upstairs and reviewed the grain assessments and went to bed. She arrived on a Thursday, which I remember only because Thursday is the day Orvith reads me the week's petitions, and she appeared in the doorway of the petition hall while he was midway through a dispute about a collapsed boundary fence, and she was the sort of person whose appearing in a doorway you notice without being able to say precisely why. Not because she was remarkable to look at. She was not particularly, or rather, she was in a way that had nothing to do with the kind of remarkability that tends to enter petition halls. No house sigil on her cloak, no ceremonial dress, no carefully arranged expression of someone who has been coached on how to address an alpha king. She had a satchel over one shoulder that was clearly very full of something, ink on her right hand, and the expression of someone who had just realized she had walked into the wrong room and was deciding whether to apologize now or after she had taken another moment to confirm it. "The archive," she said, not to me, to Orvith, who was nearest the door. "I have a letter of passage from the Collegiate of Renhalo. I rode ahead. Someone was supposed to meet me at the East Gate." "The East Gate keeper is at the boundary fence dispute," Orvith said, without missing a step, "which is currently before the king." She looked at me then. Not the way most people look at me when they realize who I am, without the small contraction, the straightening, the recalibration of expression that I had long since learned to read in the space of a breath. She looked at me the way you look at someone you have just realized you are mildly inconveniencing, and she said, "I'm sorry. I can wait outside." "You don't need to wait outside," I said. "Marin of Renhalo," she told me, as if this were useful information. "Verse keeper's apprentice. I've come to copy the archive texts in the undercroft. The collegiate sent word in September there should be a letter." There was a letter. I had signed the passage authorization myself, 3 months ago, without reading it carefully, because archive access requests from the Collegiate of Renhalo were routine, and I trusted my archive keeper to manage them. What I had apparently authorized was a young woman with ink on her hand, and a satchel full of parchment to spend as long as she needed in my archive undercroft, copying verse texts that had not been properly transcribed in decades. "The undercroft is cold," I said. "I brought a heavier cloak," she said. My wolf, who had not stirred in 20 years, moved. Not much, not dramatically, just a kind of small interior shift, like a creature that has been sleeping in one position for so long it has forgotten it could move, remembering. I noted it. I chose not to examine it. I told Orvith to have someone show her to the archive undercroft, and I returned to the boundary fence dispute, and I told myself the shift meant nothing. I was wrong, but I have always been a man who errs toward caution, and caution is only wrong in retrospect. She worked for 3 days before I went down to check on her. I told myself I was checking on the archive. This was not entirely untrue. The archive undercroft required supervision in the winter months. The cold affected the oldest carvings, and it was reasonable for the Alpha King to confirm his archive was being properly managed. It was also not entirely honest. But I am the Alpha King of Varenthal, and I had 40 years of practice at doing things for reasons I described to myself in the most defensible terms available. She was sitting on a low stool with a portable lamp beside her, copying from one of the third-wall panels, the early territorial records, dense with old boundary verse that took a trained eye to read. She did not hear me come in, which surprised me. Most people in Varenthal heard me before I reached them, a function of proximity to the alpha that the body recognized before the mind did. She was too absorbed in what she was doing. She was reading something aloud, very quietly, in the way of a person who reads difficult text with their lips to test the meter. Not the boundary record she was copying, something else. A small ledger that was open on the floor beside her stool, old enough that I recognized the binding as pre-archive, 3 centuries at least. I should have said something. I had learned over 40 years that the cleanest governance came from announcing one's presence clearly and early. I did not announce myself. I stood in the doorway and I listened, because my wolf had gone very still in a way he had not gone still since I was young, and the seal had still felt like a promise rather than a monument to one. She was reading something I did not recognize. That in itself was notable. I knew the Varenthal archive, knew it the way one knows a country one has governed for decades, by its shape and its silences as much as by its contents. The verse she was murmuring was in the old tongue, which she was clearly more comfortable with than most scholars I had hosted. She had the meter right, the particular weighted rhythm of the pre-kingdom period, the pauses where the old language breathed differently from the new. She got to a line that made her hesitate. She went back to the beginning of the stanza and tried it again. Then she laughed softly to herself, not a laugh of discovery, just the small sound of a person who has been wrestling with a difficult passage and has decided to stop taking it so seriously, and said, in the tone of someone trying a thing on for size, "Well, it hardly matters if I have the cadence wrong. There's no one here to correct me." She recited the full stanza. The seal blazed. I have been trying, in the months since, to find the word for what happened to that undercroft in the moment she finished speaking. Blazed is the closest I have, but it is insufficient. The seal had sat cold and dark for 411 years. When it woke, it did not merely glow, it filled. The carved disk went from dark stone to something that was not quite light and not quite fire, a deep warm gold that reached every corner of that undercroft and showed me things in that room I had not seen before. The archive text beneath the seal cradle, which I had always taken for a standard dedication block, was not a dedication block at all. Letters had surfaced in it, old letters, the oldest carving in the room, and they spelled a name. Her name. Not a name that could have been placed there after her birth. The style of the carving was identical to the earliest archive texts, 4 centuries old at minimum. Her name had been in that stone for as long as the seal had been waiting. She had turned around by then. She was looking at the seal with an expression of pure, unguarded astonishment, her copying forgotten, the old ledger open on the floor beside her where she had dropped it without noticing. "I didn't," she started. It was a verse in an old ledger. I was only testing the meter. I didn't think." "I know," I said. She turned then and saw me standing in the doorway, and I watched her recalibrate, not with fear, but with the particular recalibration of someone who has just realized they have done something significant in front of a witness, and the witness is the Alpha King. The mark on my wrist was burning. I had known from the archive records what the mark felt like, or I had known the descriptions, which is a different thing. The archive described it as a warmth. It was not a warmth. It was a certainty, the precise sensation of a question you have been asking for 40 years finally being answered, not with words but with the absolute physical conviction of a door opening. My wolf, who had not made a sound in 20 years, made a sound. Not a howl, something quieter, something that sounded like relief. I pressed my palm flat against the doorframe and breathed through it, because I was 40 years old and I had governed a kingdom through harder things than this, and I was not going to let my composure come apart in a cold undercroft in front of a woman I had met 3 days ago, even if every instinct I had was pulling toward her with a strength I had no honest comparison for. "Your name," I said when I could speak evenly, "is it Marin?" She looked at the carving beneath the seal, at her name in 400-year-old letters, back at me. "Yes," she said. "I need you to come with me," I said. "Not under any obligation. I need to show you something and I need to explain something, and after that you may go wherever you choose." She looked at the seal, still blazing gold, at the ledger on the floor, at my face. I do not know what she read in my face, but whatever it was apparently sufficient. She picked up her satchel. "All right," she said. I told her everything in the council chamber, with no one else present, because she deserved the full truth without an audience, and because I was not yet ready to have an audience. I told her about the seal, its history, what the archive said it was, why it had sat cold for 400 years. I told her what the mark on my wrist meant, that the bond had recognized her, that the old texts described this recognition as absolute and destined, that in every historical account of the seal's previous activation, the mark had been mutual, that I had no way of knowing whether she felt anything or nothing, and that her answer to that question was entirely her own to give or withhold. I told her about my 40 years, not all of them, but enough that she understood the specific weight of what had happened in that undercroft, not just for the kingdom but for me, the person, the man who had walked down those undercroft stairs more times than I could count and walked back up them alone. She listened with the focused attention of someone trained to receive information carefully, the attention of a person who copies texts for a living, who understands that every word carries weight and that you do not reach a conclusion before the final line. She did not interrupt. She did not fill the silences. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I see the archive text, the one under the seal cradle?" I had a rubbing made. It took one of my scribes the better part of an hour, and I waited in the council chamber while it was done, and when he brought it back up, she spread it on the council table and read it slowly, moving her lips the way she had moved them over the ledger verse, testing the old language's weight. "This was carved at the same time as the seal?" she asked. "The same hand, the archive keeper says. Same tool marks, same period." She read it again. I watched her face. She was not a woman who showed her feelings loudly. I had already understood this about her in the 3 days she had been in my archive. The way she had said "I'm sorry" when she walked into the petition hall, matter of fact, not flustered. The way she had laughed at herself over the difficult verse and moved on. What she showed when she felt something was small and precise. A stillness in the face, a particular quality of attention, the way a person looks when they are holding something carefully. She looked like that now. "My grandmother was a verse keeper," she said at last, "and her mother before her. And hers." She touched the edge of the rubbing lightly. "The collegiate says the old tradition goes back further than the written records, verse keepers carrying lines from hold to hold, preserving things that weren't written anywhere else." A pause. "I always thought they meant it practically, so things weren't lost." "Perhaps it was practical," I said, "and perhaps it was also this." She was quiet again. "You said I may go wherever I choose," she said. "Yes. And if I choose to stay." My wolf was utterly still. Not the stillness of resignation, the stillness of absolute attention, of every faculty focused on a single point, the stillness of a creature that has finally arrived at the place it has been traveling toward without knowing it. "Then I would ask you to understand what staying means," I said. "Not a copying contract in a warm room. I would not offer you that and mean this. If you stay, I am asking you to be my Luna. I am asking you because the seal and the mark and 400 years of archive texts say you are the answer to question Varenthal has been asking since before either of us was born, and because I believe them. And also, honestly, because in the 3 days you have been in my archive you have become the person in this hold that my wolf most wants to be in the same room with, and I have been an honest man for 40 years and I am not going to stop now." I paused. "I am not asking you to decide today." She looked at me for a long moment. She had dark eyes, patient and precise, the eyes of someone accustomed to reading things that don't give themselves up easily. "How long did the last 63 women take to decide?" she asked. "They didn't have to decide," I said. "The seal did not blaze for any of them." "No," she said, "I suppose it didn't." She looked at the rubbing again, at her name in ancient letters. Then she looked back at me. "The verse in the ledger, where did it come from? The one I was reading?" "I don't know. I've never seen that ledger before. My archive keeper says it came in a lot of donated texts from a dispersed collegiate 40 years ago and was never properly cataloged." 40 years ago, she said. She almost smiled. About the time you stopped hoping. I did not say anything. She was not wrong, and she knew she was not wrong, and she was gentle enough with it that I did not need to defend myself. I'll need to finish copying the third wall panels, she said. The collegiate is expecting the transcriptions. You can finish copying the third wall panels, I said carefully. And I'll want to read the full seal archive. Not just the rubbing, the original records, whatever the archive keeper will let me near. He'll let you near all of it. And I'll want to write to my mother. She should know where I am. She paused. She knew my grandmother's stories. She may know more about the verse-keeping line than I do. I'll have a courier ready when you want to send the letter. She nodded slowly, the nod of a person organizing information. Then she said, very quietly, almost to herself, I always thought the old poems were beautiful because they lasted, because they survived when everything else was lost. She touched the rubbing again. I didn't think they were directions. My wolf made a sound then that I had no word for. Not a howl, not a growl, something older than those, something that was simply yes. I kept my face still. I had governed for 40 years. But my hand, pressed flat on the council table, was not entirely steady, and I was not sure she missed that. She did not tell me her answer that night. She went back to the archive the next morning and copied the third wall panels with the thoroughness that had apparently characterized everything she had ever done. And she read the seal archive records, and she wrote a long letter to her mother, and she ate in the great hall with my household without ceremony or self-consciousness, as if she had been doing it for years. I was careful not to crowd her. I had offered her the full truth and the full choice, and I believed in both, and I was not going to undermine my own honesty by hovering. I went about the governance of Varenthal. I reviewed the snow reports. I sat through 2 more petition days and 1 very long dispute about water rights that required my full attention and received only most of it. My wolf was patient, or something that looked like patience from the outside. He had waited 20 years for her. He could wait a little longer. She came to find me on the 4th day, in the late afternoon, while I was in the archive keeper's room going over the cataloging plans she had suggested for the third wall panels. She knocked. She came in when I said to come in. She sat down across the writing table from me with the directness that I had already come to understand was her natural register, and she said, I've made a decision. I set down the catalog. My grandmother used to say that the old poems were not written for everyone, she said. She meant it about beauty, that not everyone could hear what made them beautiful, and that was all right. The poem waited. It didn't mind. She folded her hands on the table, her ink-stained right hand over her left. I've been thinking that perhaps she was talking about more than beauty. Marin, I said. I'd like to stay, she said. I want to say clearly that I understand what I'm agreeing to, and I'm agreeing to it because I want to, not because the stone said so. The stone may know things I don't, but it doesn't make my choices. She paused. I looked at your face in the undercroft when the seal blazed, before you saw me looking. I want you to know that. I was quiet for a moment. What did you see? I asked. Someone who had been waiting a very long time, she said, and was trying very hard not to let it show that it mattered. She almost smiled. You're good at it. But not entirely. 40 years, and I had thought I was impenetrable. She had been in my kingdom 4 days. I'm told I'm a difficult man to read, I said. You're not that difficult, she said. You're just careful, there's a difference. My wolf was not trying to be still anymore. He was simply full. The way a room is full when the fire has been properly laid and the doors are closed against the snow, the particular completeness of a thing that has been cold for a very long time and is warm now, genuinely warm, all the way through. The court will want a formal presentation, I said, when you're ready. I'll be ready whenever you are, she said. You don't have to be ready just because I am. She looked at me for a moment with the patient, precise attention I was becoming familiar with. "I know," she said. "That's why I said whenever you are." The formal presentation was held 6 days later, in the Great Hall, with full council and the representatives of 7 allied pacts, because Orvith was constitutionally incapable of underplanning a formal event, and I had long since learned not to argue with him about it. I had not announced the seals blazing in advance, beyond the necessary preparations. The court knew that the seal of Varenthal had done something it had not done in 4 centuries. The servants had seen the light from the undercroft stairwell, and in a stone hold with good acoustics, news travels faster than formal channels. But they did not know the details. They did not know her. She stood beside me in the great hall in a dress that was simple by court standards but well made, a deep green gray, and she had her satchel over her shoulder, which I suspected she did not entirely realize, because I was not sure she ever went anywhere without it, and I had not told her to set it down because there was something about the detail that was entirely her, and I did not want to sand it away. Lord Kervin spoke first. He was the oldest member of my council, which gave him precedence, and he had also been the one who most recently sent me a daughter to place her palm on the seal, 6 years ago, so he had a particular stake. "A verse-keeper's apprentice," he said, not unkindly but with the directness of a man who had survived 40 years in my council by saying things plainly. "No house, no lineage of standing, no Wolf rank." "The seal does not assess lineage," I said. "With respect, my king, we have no precedent in the last 4 centuries for the seal blazing at all. We have only the old records." "The old records are thorough," Marin said. Kervin looked at her. She met his look with the same patient directness she had met everything else with, and I saw him recalibrate slightly, in the way of a man who has made an assumption and is adjusting it. "You've read the seal archive," he said. "All of it, twice." A pause. "The verse line in the Renhalo ledger that activated the seal is in the same hand as the name carving beneath the seal cradle. The same hand also appears in the Eastern Collegiate Archive records from the pre-kingdom period. The verse-keeping tradition preserved it deliberately. The Collegiate's own records don't recognize the significance because the records are incomplete, but the Varenthal archive has the connecting texts." She said it the way she copied archive texts, without emphasis, with the precision of someone who has spent a long time working with evidence and trusts it to carry its own weight. Kervin was quiet for a moment. "The seal has been dark 400 years, said Aldwyth, Lord of the North Pass. "What assurance do we have it will hold now?" I raised my wrist, where the mark was visible, the bond mark, clear and warm against the skin, something that had not been recorded in the Varenthal line in 4 generations. "That," I said, "is what the archive calls confirmation." There was a silence in the great hall, not the silence of objection. The silence of a room in which something that has been out of order for a very long time has settled. My wolf was still and warm and complete, in the way of a creature who has arrived somewhere and knows it. I did not look at the lords. I looked at her, at Marin, who was holding my mark's documentation in the same careful way she held everything, and who, when she felt me looking, returned it with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance. She was not playing at certainty. She was simply certain, in the deep-rooted way of someone who has read the evidence and followed it to where it led. "Marin of Renhalo," I said for the hall to hear, "verse-keeper's apprentice. Last carrier of the Luna line." I held out my hand, palm up, the way the old records described the claiming not as a command, as an opening. "My Luna, if she'll have Varenthal." She looked at my hand. She looked at the assembled court. She looked at me. She reached into her satchel, which she had apparently been carrying the whole time, and she set it very deliberately on the floor beside her, and she put her hand in mine. Lord Kervin bowed first. I saw his face when he did it, not reluctant, not performed. the expression of a man who has served a kingdom long enough to recognize when something has finally come right. The rest of the hall followed. The seal, which my archive keeper had positioned on a standing mount in the hall for the occasion, blazed gold again when her hand met mine. I heard Marin make a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite something else. "Does it do that every time?" she said, very quietly, not for the hall. "The old records don't specify," I murmured back. "Then we'll find out," she said. It has been a year now, and the seal has blazed twice more. Once when the first wolf pup of the new season was brought to her, and once in the early spring, on an evening when we were alone in the archive undercroft and she was showing me the verse connections she had been tracing through the old texts, and she read something aloud with the same quiet pleasure with which she had read everything, and the seal simply answered, warmly, as if it was glad. I have thought in the months since about what it means to be the man who kept his composure through 40 years of disappointment, and then could not keep it through 4 days of a woman with ink on her hand and a satchel full of parchment. I have decided that composure is not the same as feeling nothing. I had always known that, but knowing something as a fact and knowing it as something that has happened to you are different kinds of knowledge. She knows more of the archive now than my archive keeper. He has said, with the dignity of a man making an admission that costs him, that she finds things in the old texts that he has been standing in front of for 20 years without seeing, and that this is not a failing on his part but a function of what she is. Someone trained to hear what the verse is actually saying, not what it appears to say on first read. I understand what he means. I have been governing Varenthal for 40 years by reading what things appear to say. She reads what they mean. The court has adjusted. Kervin, who I expected to be the last to adjust, has become the most vocal proponent of what she found in the old collegiate archive records. Partly, I think, because a man who has spent 40 years sending daughters to press their palms against a cold stone and watching them come back disappointed has a particular relief in something that finally works, and partly because he is too good a counselor to let pride stand longer than the evidence requires. The lords who said a verse keeper's apprentice at the formal presentation say it differently now, if they say it at all. They say it the way one says a fact that turned out to carry more weight than first appeared. Some of them have sent their own archivists to consult with her about the old collegiate records. She receives them with the same matter-of-fact patience she has brought to everything else. She still carries the satchel. I have stopped expecting her not to. My wolf is warm. That is the simplest way to put it. He was cold for 20 years and he is warm now, and the warmth is not dramatic. It is not a howl or a fire or a sudden brightness. It is the warmth of a thing that has been properly tended, that has what it needs. Last week she found another verse in the archive. Not a seal verse, not a bond text, just an old poem from the pre-kingdom period, the kind that the verse keepers had been traveling between holds to preserve for generations. She read it aloud in the undercroft, late in the afternoon, when the gold light came through the high narrow windows at the angle that made the carved walls look warm. She read it for the pleasure of reading it. Her voice was quiet and careful with the old language's rhythms. The seal did not blaze. It simply glowed faintly, like something keeping its own counsel. I stood in the doorway and listened, and I thought, 400 years. 400 years the stone had been waiting. 400 years the verse had been traveling from hold to hold, carried in the memory of women who did not know what they were preserving. 400 years my line had waited for the one person whose voice would wake it. She looked up and saw me in the doorway, and she said, without surprise, she had learned by now that I found reasons to be in the archive when she was there. "It's a good one. Do you want to hear it from the beginning?" "Yes," I said. She read it from the beginning. The seal glowed warm and steady, and the undercroft held the light, and outside the narrow windows the first snow of the new year had begun to fall, quiet and patient, the way the stone had been patient, The way she had been patient without even knowing there was something to be patient for. I knew what it meant, the old poem. I had read the archive for 40 years. I understood the old language. The last line of it was, "And the stone carries her name, it was simply waiting to be heard." She had named it before I did. In the council chamber, the day she agreed to stay, she had said it almost to herself. I didn't think they were directions. They were directions. For 400 years, a name in a stone and a verse in a traveling scholar's memory, moving toward each other from opposite ends of a long, cold century, through every hold and collegiate and archive that lay between, until a Thursday in early winter when a woman with ink on her hand and a satchel over her shoulder walked into the wrong room entirely, and sat down in my undercroft, and read a verse aloud for the pleasure of the meter. And Varenthal's oldest stone knew her voice.